making us sound a lot more impressive than we actually are. And thank you everyone for coming to this lunchtime talk. As Walter mentioned, the origin of this study is based out of a seed grant from OBPR, and we're really interested in understanding the impact of mass-scale demolitions that have occurred across the city, certainly since 2014, and originally the demolitions began in 2012, but as we'll see, 2014 they really scaled up. Sadly today for this lunchtime talk, we're going to be serving up somewhat of a nothing burger, and I say that because we have run into a considerable number of methodological issues, which I'm going to let Matt address momentarily. But I'm going to talk to you about kind of the underpinnings of our study. So the motivating social problem that kind of served as the basis for this study is Detroit's historical loss of population since the 1950s. So in 1950, the population of Detroit was estimated to be about 1.8 million people. Some 60 years later, 2010, that estimate was about 750,000. Accounting for this downturn in population obviously stemmed from waves of outward migration based on economic downturn and racial tension. Among many of the problems that followed the loss of such a massive percentage of the population was an overstock in the housing market. More recently, factors have also contributed to this population loss. Particularly the subprime lending schemes wreaked havoc in Detroit. In 2006, it was estimated that nearly 50% of the mortgages in Detroit were subprime. Foreclosures, obviously, on the backs of that subprime lending problem, also affected Detroit significantly. In 2009 alone, 63,000 homes, which was about a quarter of the livable dwellings in Detroit, were going through, at some stage, the foreclosure process. As a result of a loss of population as well as foreclosures, a significant blight and abandonment problem continued to burgeon. It's estimated that in 2010, about 79,000 structures were abandoned. Okay, and it peaked in 2013, around the time that the city declared bankruptcy at 85,000. So we're talking about a significant number of abandoned homes, many of which create a large source of problems for neighborhood residents. As I mentioned, in 2010, the city began to consistently demolish homes, but not anything near the level that now, or then newly elected Mayor Duggan, and just re-elected Mayor Duggan, when he implemented his demolition program. And Detroit set out on an unprecedented scale of mass demolition, concentrated supposedly in a few different neighborhoods across the city, but as we'll see here momentarily, that's not necessarily how it rolled out. And so people began to ask, what is the impact of the mass demolition of abandoned homes across the city? So anecdotally, it seemed as though residents were very optimistic about it in some cases. Right? Again, an abandoned building to someone who doesn't live next to an abandoned building might seemingly represent merely an eyesore, but that is not necessarily what it represents to people who are subjected to living next to these dwellings. And so the optimism from the community that these structures were going to be razed and removed and some of the, hopefully, corresponding social problems going away with them was high. There was also a report in 2015 produced by Dynamometrics that assessed several different things. One of the things that they assessed was property values as a result of demolitions. And they concluded that homes within 500 feet of demolished abandoned structures realized a 4.2% increase in property value, accumulating over $209 million in increased property value across the city. It's fairly important, although not the most important. Also kind of referenced in no serious way in this report was the idea that blight removal programs lend to community safety, right? So removing these structures from the community is going to somehow enhance safety of residents in those communities. And they didn't assess this in any serious empirical way, right? And so this is where Matt and I started thinking, could we devise a study that tried to thoroughly assess the impact of removing these structures on a mass scale on the community's crime and disorder problems. And so we applied for the seed grant. We were fortunate enough to receive it, and we've now been working on this for over 2 years. Now, I'm going to talk about some guiding theoretical perspectives. When I talk about them, I'm not necessarily referring to them as guiding our analyses per se. Rather, these are the theories that guided the idea behind our study. Because essentially what we're doing here is we're working backwards from a literature base that says these types of units create problems in communities. Right? So essentially what we're trying to understand is if there is a symmetrical effect when removing these structures from communities on crime and disorder. Meaning that many studies have found that abandoned and vacant buildings correspond with increased crime types, more fear, other disorder. Right? So the idea here is if we remove them, do we see a corresponding symmetrical effect? So one of the most prominent theories that we drew upon is Sean McKay's social disorganization theory. There is a rich literature identifying the effects of social disorganization on crime and disorder. Most studies use indicators of social disorder, though. Right, so we're talking about poverty, population density, female-headed households, etc. Now, Sean McKay in their original works also referenced physical features of areas when describing the 5 zones that they identified in Chicago, and they made reference to things such as dilapidated housing and abandoned buildings. But the research, with few exceptions, Sampson and Rudbush being one, where they actually used a systematic social observation methodology to code 700 blocks in Chicago to understand signs of physical disorder. Most studies use social indicators of disorder. We also draw upon this literature based from crime prevention through environmental design. And this is originally conceived by Ray Jeffrey in the 1970s, and has since grown, but basically it suggests that physical geography and design elements influence areas' criminal opportunities. And we particularly draw attention to this idea of territoriality. The idea that areas that appear to be cared for and protected are most often buffered from criminal activity. And this was a very prominent feature of Oscar Newman's defensible space, in that areas give off perceptions, and those perceptions are then acted upon. So if offenders feel like an area is not cared for, that anything can happen in that area, they're likely to act. If they feel like an area is cared for and that area's residents will respond, they're less likely to react. We also draw from the literature on situational crime prevention. And throughout this literature, we talk about concepts such as crime attractors. Okay? And crime attractors, according to the Brantinghams, are particular places, areas, neighborhoods, or districts which create well-known criminal opportunities to which strongly motivated intending criminal offenders are attracted because of these known opportunities. And throughout this literature, abandoned buildings are referenced as crime attractors. They provide opportunity for drug trafficking. Some studies have found that they increase crime generally, that is, areas that have abandoned buildings or high concentrations of abandoned buildings are associated with higher levels of crime. Increased home vacancy has also been found to correspond with more burglary, and I have home vacancy italicized because throughout the foreclosure literature, there's somewhat of a debate and what's the difference between a vacant property and an abandoned property, and because foreclosure is a process, where do you start measuring it as a vacancy? Is it when the property initially goes into that process, or is it when the sheriff actually comes in? And so, kind of accounting for the distinction or operationalizing that distinction is not always easy. But I think Boson and Hipp kind of commented most appropriately on the impact of abandoned buildings, and when they said that vacant units are viewed as providing opportunities for offenders to gather, as well as providing locations with a lack of guardianship, hence increasing the opportunity for crime. Right? So this idea that they attract individuals who want to do particular types of crime because there is no guardianship. So whether it be prostitution, selling drugs, okay? But in this literature, they also talk about crime generators. And these are places that literally generate criminal opportunity due to their existence. And abandoned buildings are also referred to as crime generators in this literature. So whereas crime attractors appeal to ne'er-do-wells that want to engage in illicit business, crime generators provide the opportunity for criminal activity to take place. So here we're talking about things such as metal scrapping, house stripping, urban mining, vandalism, illegal dumping, and squatting. Right? Abandoned units, buildings, homes, provide the space for those activities to take place. And then finally, we draw upon Wilson and Klaham's broken windows theory. Right? And they explicate a theory of urban decay that implicates the breakdown of neighborhood social capital as the primary culprit for the evolution of criminal behavior. More simply stated, minor forms of disorder can evolve into larger criminal problems if left unchecked. And so I'm just going to quickly go through this path diagram of Wilson and Klaham's theory, if you will. So they maintain that signs of physical and social disorder, right? So obviously dilapidated buildings or abandoned units are signs of physical disorder, but also social disorder, so whether it be prostitution in the streets or gang activity in the streets. These can lead to larger crime problems through a mechanism by which they create fear in residents. Okay? And then that fear alters residents' behavior, primarily withdrawal, so they retreat and interact less frequently with one another, which impinges upon their ability to affect informal social control, which then allows more serious forms of criminality to occur. It also leads to the likelihood of more serious crime occurring through this idea of territoriality. Right? Areas that look a particular way, it is suggested, gives off the perception that no one cares. And if no one cares, that means most anything can go on without anyone intervening. And then certainly there is a reciprocal effect that more serious crime leads to more physical and social disorder. As more people move out to escape those conditions, then the physical attributes of those areas tend to become less aesthetically appealing, thereby inviting more physical or social disorder as well as crime. And so when thinking about this from a more local perspective, again, I want to draw some anecdotal pieces of information surrounding the blight and demolition program in Detroit. But we can see, through media accounts that residents, clearly feel like, depending on where they live, obviously, that in some cases they are experiencing things that no one should have to. Not being able to walk down the street without interacting with a prostitute or someone hopped up on drugs is not acceptable. Right? And so these, again, abandoned buildings, physically speaking, might represent to someone from the outside eyesores, but realistically represent a whole host of other problems for neighborhood residents. Probably can't read this because it's pretty small, but just last night, a friend on Facebook posted that a house next to his mom's house, the person is letting it go, and squatters had moved in and they're selling drugs out of it. What to do? And these are not just physical features of neighborhoods that we're talking about. Of course, they are physical features of neighborhoods, but we're talking about real life consequences for people subjected to environments that house these types of dwellings. And so, as Holmberg commented in the late 1990s, crooks, killers, losers tend to infest areas with dead buildings like maggots on carcasses. Okay? Maybe a little bit more, maybe that's a little extreme, but I think the point is well taken, that individuals wanting to engage in illicit activities likely seek out areas where they feel like no one cares. And what better place to do that than areas that are not maintained? And so our current study has two primary research questions. And that's, what is the impact of the concentrated removal of abandoned homes on neighborhood level crime and disorder? And we rely on three sources of data to answer these questions. Demolition data comes from the Detroit data portal, and so do crime incidents and calls for service. And then for neighborhood characteristics, we rely on the Census Bureau's American Community Survey. I'll let Matt talk about this a little bit more in depth, but we've gone back and forth in terms of what level of analysis should this study be conducted at. Initially we thought census tract, and then we have now come to the conclusion that block group is probably the most appropriate level. But as I mentioned at the outset, we've experienced some significant methodological issues, so the only data that I'm actually going to present to you today examines demolitions. And I'll let Matt talk about the challenges that we've faced and what we hope to do moving forward. So importantly, most studies examining kind of the social disorganization frame attempt to understand why a community that looks seemingly stable ultimately devolves into an unstable community. And so here, looking at the exact same street segment, Quinn Street in Detroit, over a 4-year period, in the top 2009, looks like a fine, stable area. August of 2013, not so much. Well, Detroit is uniquely positioned to try to understand what happens when a neighborhood goes from unstable to almost non-existent. Again, a little longer time frame here, 6 years, but we can see that several of those structures have been removed. And so what happens to the dynamics in areas where these structures are removed? That's the primary question. And so some facts about Detroit's demolition project. To date, it's been awarded over $250 million in federal funding to remove blighted and abandoned structures. At the outset, 85,000 units were deemed eligible. The goal is by 2026 to have demolished nearly half of those. To date, well, as of February 18th on Sunday, 13,513 structures have been demolished since 2014. The average cost of the demolition is right around $15,000. And we have a table of comparable cities, if you will, because none are really comparable to Detroit in the sense that the rate of demolition in Detroit is just significantly higher than every other city engaged in similar efforts. So Detroit is an actual count as of February 18th. The rest are estimates from about a year ago when we actually first started putting the data together, and then we realized we had some serious issues to contend with. But nonetheless, the rate at which they were demolishing back then was nowhere near the rate at which Detroit was demolishing, so I feel fairly comfortable suggesting that Detroit is still the leading demolisher in the country. And so, again, about a quarter of Detroit's housing stock were identified as demolition eligible at that time. So initially when Detroit started out, they were one of 18, or Michigan was one of 18 states that received money from the Hardest Hit Fund, and Michigan allocated about $52 million of that original money to Detroit to engage in demolitions. And the Land Bank Authority identified 6 areas, they refer to as the hardest hit areas, where these demolitions would take place. Okay, and the idea was that they wanted to engage in demolitions in areas that were near stable, hoping that they would become stable. Right, so they identified these areas. One of the stipulations behind this $52 million that was initially given to Detroit via the state was that the money had to be spent by 2015. And what they quickly realized was that they had more money than they had vacant units to demolish in these 6 areas, and so they expanded it to 17 areas across the city. And this is where Matt and I became interested in our research questions, and started thinking about this study, and we thought, well, 17 areas, definitely more difficult than the original 6. Yes, there are some methodological things to consider because some of the areas are contiguous, but we felt like it was a manageable endeavor. Certainly not easy, but at least manageable. And so it was actually about a year ago to date that I was giving a similar talk with resident scholars of the Humanities Center, and Richard Smith and a few other folks were looking at some of the maps I created, and they said, you know what, looks like you have some demolitions that are occurring outside of those areas. And so, okay, sure enough. So now, fast forward a year later, and working on this a little bit more, we can see that, and this is in 2000, it's probably too small, 2014, 2015, 16, 17, we can see that a significant proportion of demolitions occurred outside of those 17 areas. So if we look at all of the demolitions between 2014 and 2017, okay, about 56% of the demolitions actually occurred inside those areas. Now, this created a significant challenge for us. I'm going to let Matt talk about it, because, well, I got one more thing to talk about here, but we're now moving from 17 somewhat seemingly contained areas to citywide, and we have a temporal and we have a spatial element that we have to account for. Okay? But again, looking at total demolitions from 2014 to 2017, this map displays the number of demolitions within each block group. So of the 897 block groups in the city of Detroit, 127 had 0 demolitions. The vast majority experienced between 1 and 24. And then we had 11 block groups that experienced 70 or more, with the highest being 131. So we can just see that there is a great deal of variation, not just in the sense of where demolitions are occurring, but also in the concentrations of demolitions in those areas. So now I'll turn it
What are the white groups? The white, the blank?
Those are block groups that have no demolitions.
So
And then obviously that's Hamtramck.
In Highland Park.
In Highland Park, yeah.
In the Woodward corridor too?
Yeah.
So, a variety of methodological issues, and I don't know what kind of statisticians and methodologists we have in the house today, but we're really curious to get some feedback on a few of these points. The first, as Charles noted, is that this project has transformed from a good idea into a monster. As the table indicated that he threw up, Detroit stands alone in the United States in terms of, what this demolition program looks like. There's no place else in the country that this policy is happening in this way. So now that it's a citywide intervention that we're trying to make sense of, that's occurring every day throughout the city, right? For the course of nearly 7 years now, it's proven pretty difficult to wrap our heads around, both theoretically and methodologically. And that has much to do with the fact that this is both a space and time piece. So it's one thing to engage in research that's spatially oriented. It's another thing to engage in research that's spatially oriented and has a temporal aspect too. And so the maps that Charles threw up were yearly estimates, 2014 and 2017. But really, I think, and we agree on this point, that the most ideal assessment of the demolitions program and the impact of demolitions is an assessment occurring at the monthly level. So if that's the case, then we're talking about, if we take it back to 2010, 7 years of data, so 84 months of data, nearly 20,000 demolitions occurring in nearly 900 block groups. So this is transformed in a fairly monumental methodological endeavor relative to the 6 original hardest hit funds that we had conceived of when putting this project together. A few questions that we have in kind of making sense of some of the decisions that we're trying to come to is, one is what happens after a demolition? So a home is demolished or a building is demolished. There's a variety of assumptions that you can make. The reality is, many of you know this already, is that there's many things happening after demolitions take place, right? Sometimes this space is just sitting and growing into a problematic property. Sometimes these spaces are being redeveloped, less so, but it's occurring with increasing regularity. Sometimes these spaces are being transformed into urban greening space or urban gardens. So not having an ability to be specific on that front presents some interesting predicaments in terms of the specificity of conclusions that we're able to arrive at. I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. The fourth point, neighborhoods in Detroit are ever changing. So while all this has been happening in the city of Detroit, these demolitions, these nearly 20,000 now if we take it back to 2010, we also have other important interventions that we need to control for. And so coming to decisions on this front has proven fairly difficult as well. So as an example of the Detroit Land Bank properties, right? So over 1,500 problem structures have been auctioned off and sold. So having a measure of that. The Detroit Land Bank Authority, as many of you know, has also started to work on homes themselves and sell them off, and they've sold over 500. There are currently 333 on the market. If you spread, we're talking about a few thousand properties that, at the block level have some meaningful impact, especially if residents are moving into these properties and engaging in the community in meaningful ways. So coming to some conclusion as to what the best way to incorporate that type of data and those types of measures into this is one of the things we're still chewing on and trying to decide on. And then lastly, and we can fill in on the threshold piece. Capturing the nature of effects. Right? So because these interventions are occurring every day, are occurring a given number every month and every year, determining what kind of effect that they're having is another piece of this. So is it the case that demolitions are having an impact that lasts a month on what's occurring in terms of crime and disorder in a given block group? Is it the case that the impact is 3 months? Is it 6 months? Is it a year? So is it short term or is it lasting? At the outset of this presentation, it was clear if you were listening, hopefully you were. Charles is a policing researcher, I'm a life course researcher. So this is really a big piece. A big piece of this is that we're not traditionally trained spatial methodologists or researchers. So some of these things are proving to be quite challenging. And so this has been, again, just to justify this a little bit, a slow process. And then threshold effects. So it's one thing, many of these block groups that we're focusing attention to are quite unique, right? Many of them have a notable number of residents living in them. Many of them don't. Many of them, beyond the demolitions, have vacant properties still existing and standing. Many don't. So I think the picture that Charles threw up is a good example of that, right? The before, after that community. So coming to some decision as to what extent demolitions matter in a community, what is the point at which that impact might no longer exist, if in fact an impact is what we identify. So this is again proven to be a fairly challenging idea to wrap our heads around. So moving forward, there's 4 points I want to talk briefly about. Work through methodological issues. And I have to take credit for being the overconfident methodologist that served up your cold burger today. So that's the first piece, working through some of these things. And again, I think just deciding on them. We've gone back and forth so much. But I think we're both really interested in establishing the most rigorous assessment of this policy. And some of these decisions are really important, so they're just proving time-taking. So one of the methodological points is another study that we're interested in, assessing what happens for these at the properties or parcels these demolitions are taking place in terms of social and physical disorder. So one of the ideas that we had, and we were hoping to get to sooner than later, was assessing through systematic social observation, maybe on a weekly or monthly basis, what these properties look like after the demolitions have actually been completed. So there's data right now on the Detroit website that identifies demolitions that have been completed as well as demolitions that are in the pipeline. So we know what buildings are up next, so we can do a pre-post assessment of kind of some of those other non-crime outcomes that we have interest in. Working with the city to also conduct pre- and post-test survey of residents, just to get a sense as to what at the outset of this, we had a question as to whether we've been contacted by some of the residents who are opposed to this program. And we're very well aware that those residents exist, so I think that's another important piece of this. What is it that residents of these block groups, these census tracts, these neighborhoods feel about these programs? As Charles noted throughout the presentation, there's some anecdotal evidence that suggests that many people are really happy with what's going on because these buildings are obviously visually not enjoyable, but they also cause real problems in terms of crime and disorder that's occurring there. So being able to test this with a pre-post design is something that we want to dive into next. And then lastly, and I think most interestingly, in terms of at least how I see it, are examining, similarly, the impact of demolitions on mental and physical health. Right? So there's some literature, much literature that points to these neighborhood indicators as meaningful contributors to those two outcomes. So is it the case that when these